Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Corona Café. This is Harsita from the Alliance Française. Our Corona Cafés are virtual discussions on reimagining Kenya. This is a partnership between the Alliance Française, the French Institute for Research in Africa, IFRA, and the ELIFT, a rethinking of prior assumptions in order to reimagine a better society and world. Our first Corona Café took place on the 2nd of June, and it was on healthcare systems. It was moderated by Dr. Mashai Mwangola. It is available to follow on the Alliance Française YouTube channel. Tonight, we hope that you're all well settled. And we would now like to invite Dr. Mashai Mwangola to introduce our panelists and the discussions.
Thank you very much, Asita. It is indeed such a pleasure to be here for our second Corona Café, where we are getting together to reimagine where is it that we are going. The Corona Cafés bring us together, and we've been talking about how this pandemic has not only affected us in the present, but given that it has given us a time to pause, to reflect, to really think about how we might, if I may use the words of Arundhati Roy, use this pandemic as a portal so that we do not exit back to where we have come from, but indeed we begin to reimagine the world that we would like to leave as a legacy to the next generation. Last time when we met, this was a fortnight ago, we talked about health, because I guess that's the logical place to begin with when you're talking about a pandemic. But one of the things that really came up as we were talking about was how much the question of inequality is so much tied in to the discussions that are emerging in the public sphere during this particular moment. As we spoke on health, we reflected on the ways in which the pandemic has amplified the state of our health infrastructure, and then began to discuss how we could use this moment to think about what our health infrastructure would look like by the year 2050. And what became very clear in that discussion was that for us to get to 2050 with a solid health infrastructure, we would need to tackle the question of social inequality. And therefore, it is a pleasure tonight to have two amazing minds. We've had such great discussions in the run-up to this that will lead us into this discussion on social inequality. We'll have about an hour's conversation as a panel, and then we will open it out to the audience. So we do really want to, as we welcome you in, participants, thank you for joining us, encourage you to please put your comments and your questions onto the chat, and we will come to that part of the conversation in the last half hour of our conversation. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our panel. We have Dr. Wangui Kimari, who is an urban anthropologist and the Participatory Action Research Coordinator for the Mathare Social Justice Center in Nairobi. Wangui, it's such a pleasure to have you. And in welcoming you, karibu, karibu, please, what is it that you do as a Participatory Action Research Coordinator? That just sounds so amazing.
So thank you everyone so much. I'm so glad to share and engage and collaboratively try and think about how we need to move forward as just one small step in making our state hopefully a bit more inclusive. As the PAR coordinator at Mathare Social Justice Center, what I try and do is to coordinate the community research we do. And I think our research that's most known, I think, is our research on extrajudicial killings. So just coordinating that, even if what was brought to bear in that report was the experiences of many people, from young Borana mothers to poor fathers in Mathare 4A. So just trying to collate and bring that together. And so that's the work I have the pleasure of doing at Mathare Social Justice Center.
That's amazing. And I'm assuming that at the Mathare Social Justice Center, a lot of the work that is being done at the center in general focuses on this question of social inequality. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
For sure. Thank you. I mean, as often we think, just to make inequalities a bit more raw and abrasive, we think about violences, because I think sometimes inequality doesn't make evident the extremity of violences that people have to endure because they have imposed on them a lower social position. So we do work on water access, but showing how water access impacts safety, impacts your ability to either your choice whether you're washing your child or using water to cook. So just trying to put a face on these inequalities, but also making evident in as much as we can the continuum of violences that they make people, the majority of the city, live under or live through.
And indeed, I think what you've brought out is that often when we talk about social inequality, it's not just that we have social inequality, but that there are very real consequences to people's lives. And we'll come to that in a little bit. But let me then also welcome our second panelist, who is speaking to us from Mombasa, where he has been, he's going to bring us a whole different perspective in terms of the work that, first of all, Muhuri, where he is at the moment as the executive director, has been doing, not just in Mombasa, but I know Muhuri works right all across, especially the region, the coastal region. But also Abu Bakr Zain comes to us with a wealth of experience. He is invested in good governance and the respect of human rights. And he's very, very particularly focused on the rights of marginal and marginalized groups. Abu Bakr Zain is a former commissioner of the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission, as well as, I believe, the People's Commission of Kenya before that. He's also a former member of the East African Legislative Assembly. And I know that while you were there, please correct me if I am wrong, you specifically looked into the question of peace and security. And I know the question of inequality, therefore, must have come up several times there. And he's also a former executive director of Uraia Trust, and therefore looked at this question all across the region. It's really a pleasure to have you here. And I just wondered if you might start by, especially, I just love that bit of being at the commission, a question that comes up a lot. Does our constitution at all touch on the question of social inequality? I think you may be muted. If my brother, perhaps you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I'm on now. Good evening, everyone. Greetings, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation. Yes, it's true, but let me start with the Constitution. The whole idea of Constitution transformation and the agitation of Kenyans demanding to have a new compact for themselves is informed by their circumstance, which largely is driven by wanting to be more equal, wanting to be more equitable, wanting to be more fair. They felt the old system was still, in a nutshell, a continuation of a colonial state that in its birth was based on inequality, and defining people using differences, and defining those who are an in-group and the majority of Kenya as an out-group. The in-group will acquire a lot of privileges and a lot of rights, and the out-group will be exploited. So Kenyans wanted to become whole again. They wanted to heal. They wanted to establish a framework for social justice, where everybody has an equal opportunity and everybody has an equal share in being a citizen. So in a nutshell, if you look at the construction and design of the Kenyan Constitution, it is based on those principles. So if you look at Article 1 of our Constitution, sovereignty of the people, that idea is the people who demanded it. Before that, there was debates as to who was sovereign. During colonial time, it was the queen who was sovereign, and the colonial office. During independence, it became the president, and that's why we had an imperial presidency. And there was a time parliament was also claiming to be sovereign. But the people, in their wisdom, said, no, 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 we want to establish a constitution based on the people themselves being sovereign, meaning that it is based on participation of the people. The people themselves matter, and the people themselves are the most important factor in our constitutional framework, because they are the ones who made it for themselves. And in the making of themselves, they decided to embrace certain values that will take them away from a system that was based on inequality to a system that is much more participatory and gives everybody the same rights and the same opportunities.
So then when you're talking about being invested in human rights, one of the things that's at the core of the work that you do, whether it is at the regional level or the national level or the local level, is dealing with this question of inequality, social inequality in particular.
Absolutely, and one of the major components we had to deal with when we were making the constitution, and I mean the Kenyan people, we needed to first of all admit that we did very badly in the past, and there was a lot of violation of rights in the past, and there was a lot of marginalization in the past. In other words, we had a framework that marginalized people and visited injustices to the majority of Kenyan people. So if you look at the architecture of the constitution, one of the aspects was to liberate everyone, to make everybody equal, and to also address the question of past injustices. So our constitution is unique because even the expansive Bill of Rights, you know, the former constitution had an individualized approach to human rights. But we expanded that to mean that it's not only individuals, it is communities, it's groups of people, it's categories of people. So we've put specific rights for children, for example, or for elder members of society, or for women, or for people coming from minorities, or people from marginalized communities. And we have also put in place mechanisms of dealing with past injustices. So locating Muhuri, where we come from, we have to deal with the question of transitional justice, historical injustices, historical claims, and some of the wrong structures that were built on the former constitution that made majority of our people outside decision-making and outside of benefiting from their own resources and benefiting from the common good and benefiting from their own work of their hands. So we put in place a governance system that was oppressive. And this new constitution, what it has done, it has said the people are the center of decision-making, and they will make decisions for themselves.
And what I'm then hearing from both of you in terms of the work that you both do and the places that you're both invested in, is that at the heart of talking about social inequality is this thing that people, if we want to deal with it, people then need to take control, and people need to be at the center of the narrative. And I'm listening to both of you and I'm thinking, but then really, in the society that we live, would it be fair to say what many people say? Inequality is always going to be with us. We cannot eradicate inequality, right? We're always going to, because we're in a society, we're always going to have people coming from different places. So let me ask you, both of you, if you can, as concisely as possible, how do you define social inequality? Wangoi, if I was to ask you and Daktari, how do we define social inequality? What priorities and emphases do you think should be at the heart of our definition?
So I feel strongly that in defining, I think intrinsically we know what is equality. We know that if I have a plate of food, my neighbor needs to have a plate of food. All of our neighbors need to have a plate of food. I think intrinsically we know that. But I hope that in whatever definition I would conjure, I would really emphasize the need to also recognize intersecting variations and like the intersecting qualities of equality. So it's not enough to say that that's okay if we all have, some people need a bit more assistance than others. People, for example, now with COVID, the bulk of work has fallen on women. You know, not only is there no water, they have to now take care of all their kids. They can't go to work. They, as domestic workers, they're not allowed to be there. So even within whatever definition we could conjure, I wouldn't try and conjure a definition, but I would like to emphasize that we must recognize the like intersectional qualities of equality. That for me is important. And for example, now we can say that I think as someone who is, I really hate this word, the youth bulge, but I'm going to use it so that I can also tell you never to use it again. But as someone who's teetering off this, I'm just falling off the definition of youth. I think it's really important to recognize that as part of these intersectional qualities, that generation is a class. Being a young person is also materially your class. We need to think about people with disabilities, gender, sexuality, age. So I think it's not enough to say that this person has bread and you have bread, but we're not sure how, for example, how many people in their family or what other skills they have, for example, or where they live or what they live next to. So just to emphasize the intersectional qualities of equality, yeah, not to go on too long.
Okay, so we're talking about imbalances, and while we often focus on the question of economics, and I know in the last kind of cafe we really come and talk a lot about economics, you're also bringing up that it's imbalances that mean that all of us in the society, as citizens or as residents or as human beings in a society, some people will have certain things that they bring along because of who they are. They may, it could, as you said, generational, it could be gender, it could be where somebody is located, but then we really are now talking about how do we make sure that regardless of this diversity in society, we all have the certain basics that all of us must be guaranteed.
Yes. And for sure, the certain basics need to be guaranteed.
Okay, thank you. And I can see now where you're going to be taking us into the future. Abubakar Zain, would you agree, disagree, add something to that?
I agree entirely, but I'd like to add the following. When we're talking about inequalities, it's not just the differences that people have. We are also talking about the different opportunities that are accorded to people. We're also talking about the different outcomes that people get based on social policy and based on governance structures. So when we say this, for me, there are, I think, 3 or 4 very critical things that we need to talk about. One is values. You cannot talk about inequality without talking about values. And depending on what values a society embraces, it will either lead to very acute inequalities or a much fairer, just system in the world. So what we have in our constitution is a fairer, just system, but what we have in practice is we have inherited a value system that has problems. That is why we even have a whole article talking about national values in Article 10 of our constitution. And for those who have read our constitution, almost every substantive chapter starts with values and principles, because we knew there was a problem at the value base. The second one has to deal with structure. If you have oppressive structures, if you have structures that are determining who to be rewarded and not based on values, but based on human discretion, then you will have human beings deciding who gets what. And in many cases, they'll be driven by improper motives. That is why in the colonial Kenya, white people had better privilege, better advantages, better living neighborhoods, better investments in their communities, better education, better health, and I can go on better. And in turn, those who were oppressed by this system, they had poor roads, poor households, poor neighborhoods, poor investment, and you can go on poor, because it's a structure. And the structure and system are one and the same. But once you have put values that, for example, discriminate on people, that's a negative system and a bad structure, then there is a third element, which is policy. And if you put in place policies that are biased, that are discriminatory, that are targeting certain people to be elevated and the certain people to be downtrodden, then the outcomes will be different. So let me give you an example. The so-called fantastic sessional paper number 10. In essence, what did that do? It said, let's pull all our resources from all places in the Republic, pull them together, and only invest in places where the return will be highest. And behind the return will be highest, there are discriminational tendencies that are not spoken in public. Let us give it to people who are much more hardworking. You know these stereotypes? Let us give to people who are more industrious. So you will then see you collect money from everybody and then you invest it in certain places. And lo and behold, those places tended to be the places where the president comes from. And it's not by accident, it's a structural thing. And also discrimination that is put in policy will target people for violence, and my sister talked about that, will target people for exclusion, they'll target people for discrimination. So those people who are targeted by these policies will not have good educational infrastructure. So in Kenya, for instance, we had 3 distinct regions during colonial time. The colony, the protectorate, and what was called the NFD.
Okay, I want to ask you if you can use those 3, just what you're saying, but because I do need to move us talking towards the future. Can you give me examples using just the 3 that you've talked about? That in Kenya, we've had this long structure, we've had the colony, we come from a place where we had the colony, the NFD, and the protectorate. In the current pandemic, right? What we're just going through, how have those inequalities manifested? Give me 3 quick examples of how we can actually draw that direct line to today.
So I can tell you for free, for example, not just the pandemic, but if you look at any human index, there is a lower investment per child in education in northern Kenya, followed by coast, and always the colony will be better. There is a lower investment in health. There is lower investment in everything. Now, if you want to talk about the pandemic, look at the figures in terms of the infrastructure that was already there, in terms of hospitals, in terms of distribution of medication, in terms of roads, in terms of livelihoods. So you will see the colony, people have lost jobs, but not in like in northern Kenya or in coast. For example, in Coast Province, the whole economy around the port is already dead because they moved most of the activities of the port to Nairobi and Naivasha. The other larger scale is tourism. That one is dead. And if you look at the statistics of cash transfer, just look at them. Most of the cash transfer is proportionately, I'm talking about proportionately per person, is more in the colony than in coast, and again, I'm not just talking about regions. Even in Nairobi itself, within the largest economy we have, people in Muthaiga, people in Kilimani, people in Lavington have done much better generally than people in Mukuru kwa Yaba, Mukuru kwa Njenga, in Kibera, and so on. So if you look at how much is invested in roads in Lavington and how much is invested in roads in Mukuru kwa Njenga, the disparities will be there to glare at you. So all I'm saying, I
want to bring in Wangoi on that point, because I'd like, Wangoi, is it possible for you to give me 3 examples? For example, what Zain is just telling us is it possible for you to say, look, I'm an urban anthropologist, just from the work that I am doing, I can give you examples of how this manifests in people's real lives?
Of course. And you know, when we talk about inequality, I mean, practices are accompanied by discourse. So it's really important to, and I think that's what Abubakar is talking about, that not only is it that certain populations won't get the actual service, but there'll be a symbiotic discourse that says they're lazy or they're not valuable, so they shouldn't get this discourse. And it's in the work we do in Mathare, we target both the material practice or the action and the discourse. And few people know that Mathare is one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. It's been around, initially it was a quarry, and it's been around since the late 20s. It's older than most of the other developments that were built later for Africans. They were palliative gestures. They were very minimal gestures to house Africans, but places like Makongeni, Mbotela, at least they were brought about. But Mathare is older than these places. And so why I wanted to also emphasize the narrative is that what legitimizes this inequality that's formalized, or the exclusion that's formalized, is these discussions. Until now, even if Mathare is one of the oldest neighborhoods in this town, there's no actual piped water network system that's cohesive and that extends through the 3 square kilometers. There's no secondary school in the area, even if there are 3,000 people. We did research last year on water, and we mapped out maybe 117 water points for 300,000 people. That means, informally, roughly, there's one water point. We're not even talking about whether there's actual water, but that means there's one water station for 2,000 people that's shared by 2,000 people. So these inequalities are consistently re-entrenched in particular environments. And I completely agree with Abubakar. They have historical legacies that accompany them, but also core to this is narratives that if we are to imagine a future, we can't just imagine the adoption of particular inclusive practices, but also the need to interrogate these narratives that we've been sustaining about each other and the majority of the population. 60% of Nairobi live in places that are considered informal. Okay. So these are things we need to deal with urgently.
But yeah, Daktari, if I can just add 2 more examples.
Okay,
we're being
and
told
the
that
reason you find me rushing you is because we're running out of the time, and I really want to ask what are we going to do about this?
Yeah, quickly, when we are told that one way of dealing with this pandemic is social distancing, you can do social distancing in Lavington, but you can't do social distancing in Mathare. You know, so as a policy, you know that this policy is tilted. Okay, you're also told that you can self-quarantine. You cannot self-quarantine, generally speaking, in Kibera, but you can self-quarantine in Lavington. Then a third example, you're being told that you can be treated at home as long as you have a room that can be set aside only for the patient, and that there are utensils that can be set aside for that patient. These are things that cannot be done in most of our neighborhoods, which tend to be marginalized.
I love the examples that you've given, because I think even just by narrowing it down to saying in this period of the pandemic, this is how there are very real consequences. People will die if we keep telling them, you must wash your hands, but there's only one water point for so many people. If people are told, if somebody is sick, you must quarantine them, but they can't, it just is a pipe dream to most people. So if the pandemic has been that wake-up call to us, that look, we can't continue like this. There are going to be other crises. And in any case, even when they're not crises, this is not what we want to leave, right? As a legacy for the next generation. I am happy to tell you that I am representing some very powerful Kenyans who, under Article 1, want to start thinking ahead. And they have given me the mandate to appoint the 2 of you to a 2-person committee. By 2050, we are going to have completely changed Kenya so that social inequality is not something that will be at the top of our priorities. We'll have more or less figured out how to deal with it. right? So we are now in 2020, forget 2030. You know, this group of people are saying, you know, Vision 2030 will come and go. We will not have gotten to that vision. And in any case, I don't even know if that's a vision that we want to live with. I'm giving you an additional 20 years. Wangoi Kimari, Abubakar Zain. What is it that we need to do in those 20 years, in those 30 years, to completely get rid of social inequality so that the generations that come after us will have other historical challenges, but the challenge of social inequality would have been finished. We would have dealt with it. I'm going to ask you, first of all, to tell me what priorities, what if we needed to deal with three things? These are the three most important things, because if we come up with a laundry list of too many things, we won't be able to deal with that. I'm talking to give you a chance to think. I'm then going to ask you, what are the main challenges we have to face, right? And if you know of any models, any frameworks that you think these would be good places for us to start, I'm going to ask you to share these so that by the time we are coming to live in this conversation, rather than being beaten down, we really have a vision, we're excited, and we, as you know, sovereign people, are moving towards it. As we do that, let me invite anybody who is listening on. Please, I'll be coming to you in about another 20, 30 minutes. Please do start putting your questions on the chat. And as soon as we get through, as soon as they give us these visions, they give us some practical things that we can move on to, we'll come to your questions. So I'll take it one point after the other so that you don't have to put it all down. But does any one of you want to start? What would be the three priorities, 2 priorities or 3 priorities that you think we must work on if we are going to deal with this? Abubakar Zain, do you want to start us off?
Yes, I always tell people I've come up with 3 ideas that will solve all our problems, and then we laugh together. All of us laugh together. They're so simple that we can implement them, but it's in the implementation where we have complexity. So the first one is we must deconstruct the past. There is no choice about this. We must deconstruct the past, because the past was constructed, and that construction is a social phenomenon. Then we must construct the future. So there is deconstruction, there is construction. And then we must manage the transition between the past and the future. If we are able to do that, everything will be absolutely wonderful. So let me give you some ideas of some of the things we need to deconstruct the past. We must address historical injustices. And in that, we must pay and using restorative justice philosophy, we must return dignity to those who were robbed of dignity. There were people who were jailed as political prisoners. We must recognize a wrong was done to them. We must take care of their families. There are people who fought for this in this country for independence. 50 years, more than 50 years down the line, we are still not recognizing families of those who fought for this country to be free. And they're still languishing in poverty. We have not even acknowledged them. We must restore those who are robbed of their land. We must restore those lands. We must restore resources to those who we took resources from. We must. So that's historical injustice.
I need you to move to the next 2 points.
So construction now. We are constructing a new society based on the values of our constitution. The first defense line, we must resist any attempt to water down this constitution. We must resist it. So that if you know people are coming with proposals that are going to make this constitution weaker, we shall reject those ideas. Secondly, we must trust people. You know, the discrimination comes from distrust, and say there are few select people who are more smart than others who will be entrusted with making decisions for everyone. So we must protect devolution, and we must make devolution work. Today, as we speak, in those poor neighborhoods, there are positive things going on. They are much better off relatively because of solidarity. Each person.
I'd like to come to that in terms of when we talk about the models, right?
Yes.
I just want us to hold on first to these 3 big points, because I'll come down to us breaking down so that we're actually able to think through each of the areas. So I'm picking those three. We must do, there's the work of the deconstruction, there's the work of construction, and there's the work of managing the transition, right?
Yes.
Okay, Wangoi, you give me your three priorities and I'll come to breaking them down with you as well.
So, I mean, ideally for me, it wouldn't be a panel of 5 people or a few people. It would be the work of a collectivity that's all of us. And on that agenda, my fear is that if we don't address or discuss or undermine racial capitalism, we're not going anywhere, because capitalism is going to reproduce, if we just say, okay, let us give people housing without addressing the social structure that denied them housing and said that they were not valuable enough to get housing, then it will just reproduce another exclusion. So optimally, I don't know, I think that's my hope, and that needs to be done by all of us. But if we're focusing also concomitantly, I mean, on undermining capitalism bit by bit, but at the same time, in this country, we need to talk about land distribution and land redistribution and redistribution of resources. That's completely important. And adopting the documents we already have and trying to realize the basic rights guaranteed in Article 43 of the Constitution. Right to housing, right to water, right to food, right to education. We've never been able to guarantee that, and that's pretty basic. So these are just things I'm thinking about. I mean, I don't have, all overwhelmingly for me is if we halted racial capitalism, and it has so many articulations that would, that are what is impacting our life now. But at the same time, as we work to undermine this really oppressive and heavy and long system that has so many historical injustices, we can try and realize Article 43, and we need to also heal. And I really appreciate Abubakar for talking about healing, but part of this healing is the redistribution of national resources, and land needs to be redistributed in this country.
Okay, so and then I'm hearing from you. First of all, it needs to be not a conversation that is top down or a few policy makers making it for everybody, but it needs to be a truly national conversation involving everybody. Secondly, that we need to pay attention to this question of racial capitalism that is part of the colonial legacy that we are continuing all these years after. Thirdly, that we need to get really serious about, and Zain, the reason why I didn't want you to go too far was because I knew Wangoi was going to come back to also this question of we must think about historical injustices and what their legacy is. So it's not enough just to say, okay, this happened and that was bad. So you gave the example of the famous session of paper number 10. And I know in the last Corona Café, we will really come and question and talk about the economic models, but also all that comes with that. But that's the third thing that we are hearing. Fourthly, and I'm hearing this from both of you, we must be very serious about what frameworks guide our thinking, right? And both of you have specifically talked about the Constitution, and I'm sure that there are other documents. And I'm conscious that what both of you are saying is we've got stuff that we must do within our communities and us ourselves as Kenyans, but then there's also part of it that spills over into the bigger spaces, into the regional space, into the global order, that this is not something we can do, even though there is work that we must do within Kenya as it is. So can each of you talk to me a little bit about, okay, we set out to do all these things. What are some of the challenges that we must deal with, right? If we woke up tomorrow and said, we've got a great agenda and we're going to do this, there are forces or there are things that are going to make it difficult for us to do this. What are some of those things that we must pay attention to? Any of you?
One thing that's very crucial for me in this very divided city is cross-class solidarity. I don't think that happens enough and in a substantive way. It happens when, forgive me for being a bit crass, but it happens when middle-class people have so much angst about something on Twitter and they'll donate food somewhere, but they're not actively committing themselves to questioning first why people are discriminated, but also contributing to like an environment that will make sure people have food. So I think for me, cross-class solidarity in a substantive way is very important. Just one consideration.
So that's one thing we're going to have to deal with. Okay, I'll come back to you if you have another one. Zain, what's a challenge that you think we've got?
I'm in Mombasa, so in the background you will hear the muazzin, which is calling people for prayer, but at the end it says, pray in your house, pray in your house. That's the difference between this particular muazzin and the other muazzins. But for me, we have to change our mindset. And we can only change this mindset with a different kind of education, because the kind of education that has been embraced in Kenya tend to make the inequalities bigger and put people in their so-called places. So we must transform our education, continuous adult education, civic education. That's number one. Number two, we must mobilize differently. You know, in the past, every time we had a national issue, we mobilized for independence, we mobilized for the introduction of multipartyism, we mobilized for constitutional reform. And the mobilization and the organizing are two interrelated ideas, and we must do it differently. And then lastly, for me, we must go back to the basics. And the basics for me are, forget this madness about the role of private sector. Corona has shown us private sector cannot do a lot of things, and they will come back to the public coffers to be supported during a pandemic such as this. So go back to the basics in terms of common good, investments in education, in health. Go back to the great ideas of self-reliance. Go back to the ideas of saying that we cannot privatize education or health. These common goods must be owned by the people, and those who required it most must be the ones who have the greatest access, and not the way it is now. So in a sense, we're saying we must go back to community mobilization. You will find that in the neighborhoods that we're talking about, people think they are poor. They are much more organized during this pandemic, and they take care of each other better than other people. So we must reject imposition of ideas that of structural adjustments and forcing to sell the family silver by saying you must sell to the private sector everything that is public. We have seen that doesn't work. We don't have any social network. But the last one is we must reinvent activism. And the activism is not only demonstrations. For me, the most powerful tool is the little money you have in your pocket. You must decide how to direct the money. You must be a conscious spender. You must decide you are no longer going to spend any money to those who oppress you, part of the systems that benefit from you. Social boycotts have worked everywhere in the world, and we must return to the basics and say, I will direct my money to a fellow struggler so that I can build their business. And those businesses that have been attacking people, have been irresponsible, have been taking disrespectful approaches to ordinary people, I will restrain from spending that money from them. Businesses of corrupt people, we know who the corrupt people are, and they try to clean their corruption money by business. We say we will not become people who are patrons to these businesses. We will not spend this money. And you don't need to be threatened. It's your money. It's you who will decide how that money will be spent.
So what I'm hearing from both of you, and this is I find really striking, is when we talk about the kind of challenges that exist, one of them is that we need to do this together instead of working, in terms of saying that group of people have a problem, they need to work on it, and the rest of us will sympathize from a distance and maybe send a little bit. And the reason I'm saying this is that often when we talk about social inequality, the big thing that everybody starts to talk about is we need strong social welfare programs where the state will put money into communities. I'm not hearing that from both of you. What I'm hearing from both of you is that we need to take seriously ourselves as the solution. I know I need to go to the questions and answers, but where do we put the state in all of this? Does the state have any responsibility? Is the state part of the solution, or it's completely part of the problem?
Yeah. Okay, there are two states.
Yeah.
There is a state that is envisaged by the Constitution, that is based by to serve the people, and the people themselves who define this state. And then there is the remnant of the colonial state that hangs around in the shadows. The kind of state that come about until the Judicial Service Commission, that we have damaging information about the judges who have been vetted. And when they are asked, what is this damaging information? We're saying we are not at liberty to say. See, those gray, dark shadows of the remnant state are illegal. They need to be completely expunged from our structures. They are the remnants. These are the ones we need to handle during transition.
So let's assume we expunge them. Does the state have any role in terms of dealing with social inequality? Wangoi?
Absolutely. Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Abubakar.
I was just saying, when you say the state are also state institutions. So in our architecture of state institutions, we have three classical arms of government: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And the executive and the legislatures include those in the county governments. Then we have constitutional commissions and independent offices. All these were designed to work for the people, so that good people need to come out and seek these offices, so that they can go and implement what is the power of the people that has entrusted them in this institution. So if you're a judge, be able to, without fear and favor, dispense justice.
So you're saying that the state does have a role. I
Yes.
need to go to the questions, but I want to hear from Wangoi. What would that role be?
So for me, the state in its current iteration or version cannot be taken anywhere towards the liberation of people. It's the same state that is very punitive. It will punish you if you don't have a mask instead of providing a mask. It's the same state that will say, let's have Harambe so you can build your own schools while everyone else is eating in the public office. It's the same state that will allow for structural adjustment programs, still has privatized water, privatized healthcare. So in its current version, for me, it cannot possibly be directed towards people's redemption. However, I think there are definitely possibilities to reclaim the state and take it in the direction that we need for our people. So and that way, if the state is at the actual service of the majority of this country, then for sure it needs to be embedded and co-opted into providing services for all of us, into creating equality. And that's what it should be inherently, but currently it's just an elite government. It's just an elite state, unfortunately.
So what I'm hearing from you then is I'm going to add this question of reforming the state to make sure that the state and Abubakar has shared with us the different offices of the state and different institutions of the state. We need to, and it's interesting for me because both of you seem to be really, let's say, struggling with imagining this state and what the state would be doing by the time we get to 2050. So we know that that's one of the challenge. I'd really be keen to hear, okay, so assume that we've done it and it's there, not immediately, because I do want to go to the questions, but I would really be interested in hearing, so then what will that state do? Before I go to those questions, what's the role of the global community? Is there a space for international institutions, whether these be regional or continental or global? And if not institutions, just how do we deal with the question of social inequality, knowing what the global order is and that Kenya is part of the world?
Go ahead, Abu
So,
Bakr. Yeah.
yeah, so for me, a number of things. One of the things that you observe globally is the absence of multilateral action. There are no people coming together and say, let's solve this global problem. Majority of politicians are either missing or they are busy only talking about their country or their little space, what they are doing for their people. The other glaring thing that is missing out of this is the loud voices from the so-called development agencies, including the World Bank, the IMF, and completely lack of ideas. They can only talk about, we can give loans to people during a pandemic that is creating poverty. You are still thinking of loans and then a little bit of debt relief. So these international institutions completely have lacked any clue. So what do we need to invest in? The people who, even in Kenya, politicians, first of all, they were missing. And people were trying to make sense out of their lives. And when they came back, they came with all irrelevant things about consolidation of political power, sorting out political differences in their parties, nothing to do with Kenyans. So what should we focus on? One, we should focus on the good things that are happening. Citizens are coming together to solve their own problems in their neighborhoods, in helping each other, in organizing themselves, in providing water for themselves. Some of those state institutions, they have been forced by pandemic to unwillingly to start implementing some reforms we have been demanding for a long time. Decongestion of jails. Our prisons has, majority of the people in prison are poor. They are from poor background. The justice system is targeting poor people. But suddenly they said, okay, let's release the old and the women and the sick and those who have served their sentence.
I need to wrap this up on the global order because I need to go to questions, and I see
So
a number
the global order, two things. We must build alliances between citizens of the South and the North for negotiation of building critical masses for reforming international governance systems, including the United Nations. The people must put pressure to do that. Secondly, we must build solidarity of sharing lessons of how they have coped in different parts of the world and build consensus in moving forward global agendas, for example, on protection of the environment.
Okay, those are excellent, and I hope I'll be able to come back and ask you about some of those models. Wangoi, how do we deal with this fact that Kenya is part of the world?
So in thinking about this, for me, I'm very conscious, and I know we're also very conscious of the hierarchies that exist in international relations or the way that states interact. And so on a formal front, those formalized structures, I'm not so interested in. I mean, currently, they're not that inspiring for me. What I'm inspired by is grassroots movements everywhere who offer solidarity and internationalism. So I'm too fundamentalist in not considering these multilateral institutions or formal international relations, but for me, they invested with hierarchies, racial hierarchies, economic hierarchies. I'm not interested. However, what I think is important, and because I think in order for us to have, to extend solidarity, but also to receive substantive solidarity, we must also support the many grassroots and individual and collective efforts that people are engaging in at home. For me, I'm so inspired by the mothers of victims of extrajudicial killings. So the mothers whose children have been killed and their wives, because they come together, they form a chama, they march on the streets and they build relations and they ask each other, can you become an activist? That's a question that they ask each other. I'm inspired by community health workers who in Nairobi are taking care. Now they have, additionally, they have to deal with victims of COVID, but they're dealing with, without any provisions by the government, but community health workers trying to make sure that sick and ailing people in their communities can thrive. I'm inspired by the Social Justice Center Working Group and the 30 justice centers that are in different parts of the country and trying to convene their communities to allow for collective people power. And so I think they're the ones who, in reshaping Kenya, will reshape Kenya's role on a hopefully global, more horizontal stage. So that's in focusing on the local. I know that it's also their gestures for change and for work are also going to impact the global stage.
Okay, and I agree with you. I think that's really that we impact the big picture by focusing on where we are and what we are doing. However, there are people who would argue, Wangoi, that sometimes, you know, there's only so much you can do at this level, given the kind of world that we live in. And so that even if we were to change Kenya, right? And Kenya fits into a particular global order. Kenya is part of the East African community, part of the African Union, and as part of Africa, as part of the global South is a term that has already been used. There are certain things that there is only so much we can do, right? So how do we take from those grassroots, from where we are, where the real work is happening, and transform this global order? Or do we give up and say, you know what, there's only so much we can do?
I think maybe what I should emphasize is that it's the formal structures that have really, to be honest, not done much for humanity. I can't really, maybe they haven't done much for humanity and we can't look at them to offer examples for what we need to do for humanity. I'm interested instead in movements in Haiti who will demand that cholera should not be brought into their communities and connecting with them. I'm interested in the internationalism that can come from people who are organizing in informal ways that undermine the very structures that oppress them. Obviously, it's not perfect, but for me, that is more what appears to be more interesting and more will lead to more substantive change if that's really what we're looking for, and not incremental palliative change, but like substantive change.
Okay, and that's a great place to pause the panel conversation, because I do see that we have many questions coming up. Let me just remind everybody that this is the second of the Corona Cafes, and today we are talking about social inequality and how we can eradicate that in our country, but also now looking beyond that. And that we will now go into half an hour of question and answer. And I'm going to just look at some of them. The first question that I can see is, Wangoi, I think you're the one who brought up this term, racial capitalism. And the question is, can you please say a little bit more about racial capitalism? I'm going to also, as I ask, as you put down your notes, Zane, there is a question. So that was from Marie-Louise Cantamase. Zane, Taivi, I think, is asking a question as a foreigner who's living in Kenya, who notices that many Kenyans don't seem really keen on embarking on social activism and speaking out. How do you mobilize all of the society in a constructive way, right? And as your I know we've already began talking about that, but how can we really, we both of you brought up this question of we need to have this cross-class solidarity. Give me one practical thing that we can do that would help mobilize people. Wangoi, racial capitalism.
You know, in some ways it's a bit of a redundant term because capitalism in itself is racist. But the reason racial is placed before it is to emphasize that even in this quest to look for profit over people, its foundational fuel is slavery and enslavement. So this is, and its manifestations now are so evident in various spheres, in how, for example, I'm trying to give examples that also focus in Kenya, but corporations exist and they got money by the devaluing of people's labor, and also, for example, the sugar industry transformed the world. It actually created countries because of profit. So many countries in the Caribbean were created just from this racial capitalism that could take people's bodies from Africa in service of people's desires for sugar in Europe or elsewhere. But in Kenya, how that is manifested is that we don't have an imagination beyond the economic system we have. So we are okay to always mimic economic systems that, for example, in the US, we're okay to devalue people's labor. We're okay to say that, to privatize basic services for people. And so there are many cascading effects of racial capitalism throughout history, but in some ways it's redundant because capitalism is built on enslavement and is built on the devaluing of people's labor. And that extends to a police force because capitalism has many facets. So it's not just a corporation, but the people who guide the corporation, the people who guide the geographies that render these profits. So I hope that's a bit clearer. There was another question, but maybe Bubaka can answer it on how do we mobilize people? I think that was the next question. How do we rally people?
I really appreciate your answer. I know the Alliance Française was one of our hosts, hosted an interesting conversation last month on the documentary Slavery Roots. And one of the conversations, the big conversations that were had, if you get a chance to watch the documentary, anybody, is that it really goes into that in great detail. So thank you for that. That was a really concise way of putting it together. Waka, would you like to comment a little bit more about how we can come up with that cross-class or cross-group solidarity?
Yeah, if you can permit me to add in this debate about racial capitalism, you have to go back to the idea of the doctrine of discovery, where two nations, Spain and Portugal, were given authority by papal bulls to invade, to vanquish, to exploit, to own, and to put in perpetual slavery any nation that was not Christian. And that authority has continued. This idea of invading people. For Kenya, it was 1498 when Vasco da Gama arrived in Mombasa and introduced the people of Mombasa to shock and awe, bombarding the whole town for no reason up to a smittens. But I'll leave that for another day. But on the question of what do, we must build small working communities. So Muhuri has been working whatever we can with the justice centers. We've been working to see how we can build synergies. So working models are important. Secondly, we must bring together all those who are for change and say, can we work together? In other words, building a critical mass.
How do we do that?
How we do that? Because we know each other. So we need to link with each other as individuals, as people. If you are a Kenyan listening to what we're talking about, go to the nearest transformative institution to you. If it's a justice center, if it's a Muhuri, if it is a Katiba Institute, and say, what can I do? Thirdly, I want to push you on this thing, because the question is, what about people who, I don't know those places? I'm not somebody who, I know no activists. I'm somebody who comes from a very safe space. Dr. If you give me a chance, I'm going through a list.
Okay.
So the next one I'm saying is that you need to educate yourself. You need to read a lot. You have to contemplate a lot as an individual. But I'll remind you, I talked about ethical earning and ethical spending. You have to take a decision as a Kenyan that you will not exploit another Kenyan. By doing that alone, you will be helping a great deal. But also you must boycott. You must boycott those banks that are exploitative, those products that are exploitative. Have you asked yourself, why is there the nicotine content in cigarettes sold in Africa is of a higher level than anywhere else in the world? Have you asked yourself why the alcohol content sold in alcoholic drinks in Africa has the highest content than any other? Have you asked yourself where there are no limitations for harmful products targeting the youth? So again, it is withdrawing our labor, withdrawing our money, withdrawing our support. Don't forget, we are the same Kenyans who are called by people who oppress us and turn up in large numbers and sing and chant for them. So, two last things is this. A very old and good professor in Kenya said, we must appreciate that people can resist in different ways. There are those who can resist by coming out in the streets. There are those who can be in the cyberspace. There are those who can lead social movements. There are those who can lead strikes. There are those who can lead demonstrations. There are those who can lead education. Political education is key in this. And last but not least, in our own neighborhoods, we must understand the role of the things that we do to harm each other. We must attack gender-based violence. In our neighborhoods, we must not allow any one of us to lift their hand based on gender and attack women or children or girls. We must also be kind to each other. So if we ignore these people, the ones who oppress us, it's someone else reminded us, we are many, they are few. The only difference is they are organized, we are not. They are mobilized, we are not. If you talk about the police work based on our taxes. We should also start a movement of just saying we are not paying taxes. As Kenyans, if all of us refuse to pay taxes, what will happen? You know, so they are there. I've seen people asking, what can I do? You can do by lifting your hand. You can do by talking about it, but you can also do it by hating it in your heart and say, that old system that exploits people, I'm not party to it. Neither would I be party to their values. Neither would I be party to displaying their values. If they have greed, I will no longer be greedy. If they discriminate, I will not discriminate. If they exploit, I will not exploit. How many of us treat those who work for us fairly?
And now you see, you're starting me, and I want us to go on with that, but I do also want to get to a couple of other questions. I have a question from Emmanuel Shikuku. Could the panelists please comment on the agency of the devolution structures for social equality? And I think both of you, you know, whether you speak in general or you speak from where you are, coming from, at least you're currently placed in Nairobi County and Mombasa County. That is county number 1 and county number 47. So between you, you cover the country. But this whole question of, is devolution a way of taking us towards social equality?
Can I go first?
Sure.
The reason why we devolved was to trust people. The old system did not trust people. It said that smart people are located in Nairobi and they'll make decisions for everybody else everywhere in Kenya. In turn, we were saying, trust all the people in Kenya. They will make decisions that are best for them. This is what is the subsidiarity principle in our construction of what devolution is. Meaning, we trust neighborhoods, we trust communities, and we trust the counties. And in those counties, people will have an opportunity to govern themselves. They will have an opportunity to elect their own local officials. And they will have an opportunity to put to work a budget for themselves. In other words, setting for themselves their own priorities. What we did not do with devolution is to work with Kenyans so enough and say, forget about the demonization of politics. We cannot demonize politics to an extent that good people don't come to run for office. We must encourage young people who are well-meaning, well-educated, and they want to make a difference in their lives to run for office as MCA. And as an MCA, you are able to control the purse of your county. Let's ask people to run for governor, young people. And we need to organize now to get people to get IDs. You think why they don't give young people IDs? It's because it is power in their hands. So fight for young people to get IDs, fight for young people to register as voters because they have been eliminated and they've been told the politics is dirty, and only take money and vote for whoever gives you money. So a political education component and a civic education component is critical to explain to people how these structures work and how we can take over those structures. And it will not matter what they do at national level much. If we can change our own circumstance in our neighborhoods, in our small spaces, we can direct money to education, to health, to water, to the most important elements that make a difference to our people. That's why, for me, I'm completely convinced that devolution is absolutely important.
So that's something that we're going to add, that by 2050, we've got to make sure that this local level control of resources and control of the decisions on the things that matter is down to that level. Wangoi, what would you like to add to that?
You know, I think that it's entrenched in law is great, but at least thinking about, of course, there's the wonderful example of Makueni, but then there's also a constituency like Mathare where the MP there was a list of MPs or ward representatives who don't go to their assembly. Mathare, of course, all their representatives feature very high on that list, or who don't say anything. So part of the problem is that I think, and also maybe this is just my own thoughts, but when the calculus is, do I have unga or do I have water, and this person momentarily will give me unga and I'll vote for them, or when the calculus is not what has this person done for my community, or what are they going to do. It's not, you don't, to put it simply, if there's not, if for example, you don't have very many options that are running because that is already controlled from levels that you don't have. So you're not invested in the process really, because you already, that your options are not ones that come from your community and that are not representing you. But at the same time, if your vote can be swayed by the provision of something you don't have, rather than your own investment in what your community needs. So if you're told, Leo, Mom, I'll give you a sufuria, just vote for me, and you're swayed that way because of that, rather than you may want to think long term, but here's a promise that you can't pass up because these are services that were not given before. Then if that is the calculus, we need to, for devolution to really work, we need to remove that calculus. We need to invest people with all their basic services first, so we can see the real fruits of the possibilities of devolution, I think, in a more substantive way. But there are wonderful examples like Makueni, for sure, and that's great. I also agree that we need political education, but there are many, unfortunately, and Mathare has had 2 people from Mathare who've run, but they've never gone far enough, and that's a big shame.
So in terms of, but you're agreeing that, if I'm hearing you right, that in terms of because we're thinking about, yes, we stand in the present, but if we're thinking into the future, that the way to go in terms of getting towards social equality would be to make sure that people have control of their resources at the local level and figure out how to make it work. You had spoken about, and I think you're the one who came up with the question on youth, and talked about how important it is for us when we think of equality to think about generations. Joy Jama is asking, what roles are the junior youth, and now we're talking about people below the age of 20, obliged to engage in order to assist in alleviating social inequality? What can we do to actively participate in fighting social inequality? So Wangoi, do you want to take us a little bit more of what your thinking was in that direction?
Well, I think part of, not only are youth who are, I think 70% of the Kenyan population is under 35. So they are without a doubt, the majority demographically. But what youth are also fighting against is this narrative that always will say, okay, you're only a dividend or you're a time bomb. You can only be, if you fit into a neoliberal entrepreneurship role, then you're a benefit to society. But if you don't, you're just a time bomb. The problem is we have bought many youth have bought into that, in that they're not seeing the agency they have as a generation to go against all of these narratives that are thrown at them. And the options that they're given are very limited. You know, they're told you, okay, you need to be an entrepreneur, but finding a license for your business is very hard. They tell you need to go plant food be an agricultural entrepreneur, but no one is distributing land, you know, and it's controlled like elsewhere by men and older men, you know. So it's really, I think this is the problem we face. However, young people are so, their power is unlimited. And you can see that in the amazing things they do in their communities, whether in Mathare, there's the creation of a biogas, looking at the gaps that exist in the community, but also coming together. There's actually a biogas small factory in Mathare, you know, or in reinventing narratives about themselves in their histories and pushing against the narratives, the historical and present narratives that are told about them. But ultimately, from my experience, and I'm trying to cling on to be a youth, but I can't be a youth anymore. I think one of the things that I've learned the most over maybe the last 10 years of trying to be involved in community groups is the need to co-create the future you see within a formation of young people, just co-creating, but also working towards it. And this, I think this co-creation, pole pole, will bring some change, but coming together is very important. And also questioning derogatory terms like youth bulge or time bomb that are circulated not only by your government, but by larger institutions, international institutions.
So not getting intimidated as youth, but starting to, even within your youth groups, even if you're under 20, figuring out like people like you, and then starting to work on things and finding allies, both across the generation, but across wider. Zain, Joaquin Warumba is asking, what, if at all, do you see the role of Kenyans living in the diaspora? And I'm saying that because I know you've worked on that area.
Yeah, a very important role. If you look at our history, transformation in Kenya has always been an intersection between all spaces being occupied for struggle. And the diaspora has played a very important part in the struggle. During colonial time, where conditions did not allow for activism of the kind that could be done outside, it was a bit dicey. But how to delegitimize oppressive systems has to be done at international level. For example, Kenya today is campaigning to be part of the Security Council in the United Nations. At the same time, it is promising great things for observation of human rights, regional peace, constitutionalism, and so on. And the same government is flattening and attacking ordinary dwellings of people who are struggling with the pandemic and struggling with making a living, and flattening them out completely with bulldozers. And at the same time, they want to be a world leader. So again, the people in diaspora would be the ones who lead this kind of activism. I've seen people talking about what role can they be playing. They can play the role of political education. They can play the role of fundraising. They can play the role of exposing people to different models. They can play the role of mobilizing international opinion. They can play the role of coordination, of participation. And I've seen people talking about international systems. If each and every one of us must determine what is our role, but we must invest in what I was saying, which is a critical mass. Critical mass comes from collective action. And collective action comes from negotiation, comes of solidarity, comes of sharing values, and come from mobilizing and organizing. So those are things that you cannot talk about one and not the other. So it is a whole system of comprehensive social action at the group level and comprehensive social action at community level, but also at national and international level. Let me give you an example. When people talk about systems and systems, we need to change systems. Take India, for example. India today is led by people who are very anti-people, who are very oppressive. But if you look at a state like Kerala, they have built a different system there. For a long time, Kerala has built a different system. And Kerala is doing much better in handling the pandemic than generally the largest state called India. So again, these nuances of people being able to create models and systems that work is important.
Okay, but how do we fit in the diaspora very specifically? People who they're invested in pouring into this country, invested in working on this issue, but they're not sitting here. And some of them may not even be in a place where they're close to other Kenyans physically. Does the diaspora have a role and a responsibility?
My sister, Dr. Mshai, I'm not one of those who come from the school of thought and say, you need a member of parliament slot for diaspora. I'm talking about working with the general people. Why are they not investing in social justice centers? Why should we only depend on fundraising from donors? Why are we not giving support to working models of systems that are working and say, I'll put my money there. I will promote this. I'll become a warrior in the cyberspace to expose evil and name and shame those who are oppressing people in Kenya. I would put money in IMLU because they are doing great work in terms of police violence and also helping people in terms of healing and getting treatment. So there is a lot of space for them to do. It's just a matter of saying, how do we sit down and agree? So maybe at some point we should have this renewal of action from where you are, whatever place you are in the world, you can contribute to the struggle.
Okay, and I have only time for a couple of, and I'm going to ask you guys to be very, very short because I have, as usual, many questions coming in at the last minute. So really like 1 sentence, 2 sentence, quick answers. One question is coming from Victor, and he's asking, in what ways are technological advancements exacerbating or alleviating social injustices in Kenya today? Either of you, quick answer.
For me, I think the inverse, I don't know if that's a word, the inverse of that question that we receive all the time is, how is technology helping struggle? And I think the answer we give is that people need to be doing the work first before technology helps them. So I think equally, for if technology is exacerbating or impacting efforts for equality, it's because people are doing the work first. And so it's just a complement. So we need to invest in people who are doing the work.
Okay.
So
and
I agree with Wangoi, but I would like to add 2 sinister aspects of the technology in Kenya. This perception that children can learn through technology. That is, you're talking about maybe 1%. Inequality, a majority of Kenyans cannot afford to use that technology in wherever they are, in rural areas and in other places. But secondly, there has been an insidious use of technology in the so-called contact and tracing and quarantining people. And they are doing this outside the legal framework. And they are invading personal, private space. And this is being done in an unholy coalition between service providers and government agencies, including security agencies, without any limitations of law. And how do you roll that back? That is something that could be worth a longer discussion on.
Thank you. I'm going to give the final question to somebody who was a panelist last week, and I'm really, really pleased to see that Dr. Eric Masese is following us and joining us. And he asks, can inequality be separated from individual values, morals, and ethics? And I think we've almost come full circle to where we started. So can we separate this question of inequality in society from individual ethics, morals, and values?
The answer is no. And I also like to say it is not individual. It is our collective values. It is our collective aspirations. It is our collective direction to establish a just society. The individual characteristics are useful, but you must look at the socialization processes and what values they teach these individuals, but also collectively, what values do we embrace ourselves? So again, the question of values, I said, is what informs ideology. So if you operate from the point of view that you want to exploit people, you will then develop a justification why certain people have to be exploited. But if you believe in equality and equity, then you will develop an ethos that is all inclusive, all encompassing, and respecting all people without discrimination.
Thank you. Ongoy, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, we shouldn't forget that Kenya, in the state that it is, in the territory that it is was initially in function of an imperialist project, a way to extort resources, a way to subjugate populations. And for sure, the foundation of this state is going to shape the interactions we have even now. And these are ethics, and people internalize these imperialist processes or these oppressive processes. At the same time, I agree completely that along the history, throughout the history of our country, people have been undermining these ethos that are imposed in this geography that we call Kenya. And so we shouldn't generalize, we can't remove people's individual responsibilities to partake in collectivity, and we must emphasize it, but we also know that the foundation of this state throughout the history of Kenya has sought to divide and rule and to make sure people internalize imperialist processes and individualized processes and undermine people's culture and Ubuntu-ness. So we can't, I think the question is, can we, how do we prioritize people's individual responsibility to ethics? No, but not at all, but we must come as a collectivity. And we must also not forget that our state functions to make sure that we are not united in its foundation. So we must always try and uphold the structures and the efforts that unite us to end all the exclusions that are invested in the foundation of our country.
Wow. I'm going to come back to each of you and ask you just for a final word. But before I do that, let me just thank everybody who has asked a question or made a comment. There are some really great comments. I'm going to read out a couple of them as we do that. And we really, really do value that you have come on, you've stayed on, you've kept us engaged. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get to every single question and comment, but we really are going to go through all of them. I know after this, we'll talk about these with the panelists and see how some of your comments can be even incorporated into our thinking with the next cafes. Gilbert Omara encourages us to invest in social justice centers, that they definitely do work. Shiko Ndua says that I tend to think political leadership has become redundant. In my opinion, the same pattern of events from elections to campaigns. And she goes on to explain why that we need to just put the politics on the side. Zarina Patel says that as long as we refuse to recognize that we are living in a class society, in a capitalist system, which is dominated by imperialism, the future we imagine can only be a wish list. And actually, we will come back and talk about this at length in the final Corona Café. Let me get a couple others that Salvi says that basically a culture of political participation at all ages and levels is needed. Zahid Rajan, who's actually commented a lot. Thank you, Zahid. says we need bold, brave leaders with integrity and political clarity to work among the masses and leave self-interest aside. There's so many comments, and I wish I could read out all of them, and I really can't, because I'm getting signals it's time and we really must bring this to an end. But I do not want to end without asking Abubakar Zain and Wangoi Kimari, what are the last words that you would leave us with? If there is something you want us to take away, what is it that you would want us to take away with us? Abubakar?
I think if you look at the comments people have made, there are a number of things that are critical and are important. One, we must deal with the question of system or structures. Oppressive structures will not come down by themselves. We must bring them down ourselves, number one. Number two, it's about the people. It's the people themselves who we must invest in. Not individuals, but the people as a collective. But in the collective, individual action is also important. So in a sense of saying, how do we build solidarity, which is then used as a resource to fight the structures, but also to treat each other equally, equitably, fairly, and we start establishing models that are already working, small models. Thirdly, the question of personal responsibility is critical for me as well, that we cannot, for example, be fighting injustice at national level, but the spaces that we control, the little spaces that we control, there is injustice there. We cannot talk about decent, fair work, and then people who work for us, our drivers and so on, we don't pay them decent work. So we must leave the transformation that we seek to establish. And we must be willing to be judged by not only what we speak, but our actions.
Wow, thank you. We will be judged not only by what we speak, but by our actions. Wangoi, what is your final word to us?
Just as a small compliment to what Abubakar said, I think we must sustain an imagination that doesn't see exclusion as normal, and that can think of a way to organize our state, our social economic lives beyond the oppressive system that we have. So let's just work to it hard. We're always battling this punitive state, but to sustain this imagination that other worlds are possible, and social inequality shouldn't be normalized. So that's all.
Social inequality shouldn't be normalized, and each one of us can do something about it. I'm seeing a comment from a participant. Wangoi Wagoro reminds us that today is International Day of Family Remittances. And I think that's one of the real basic ways that we look after each other. It is also the Day of the African Child, and we surely must imagine a future that makes it certain that the children of people who are children today and the children of the generations yet to come will inherit a better country, a better continent, a better world. I want to thank everybody for joining us in this second cafe when we have talked about social inequalities. This is the second of 4 cafes. The next cafe will happen on June 30th at about the same time from 7 onwards. And we will be talking about education, because this has been another area that this particular season has really made us to think and to talk about. The conversation will be put up and you can catch it on the Alliance Francaise YouTube channel. You can also catch it on the Elephant. And we do hope that you will keep the conversation going on social media with each other, most importantly with your own community. So thank you for joining us. Thank you very, very much, Wangoi. Thank you very, very much, Abubakar Zain. I encourage everybody to look up and see the work that is happening at the Mathare Social Justice Center and at Muhuri, and all the many spaces where this wonderful conversation is not only continuing in words, but actually in action. Have a wonderful night, all of you. Okay, I think it is safe. We are just us. Congratulations, guys. Thank you very much. That was such a great conversation. At least I enjoyed myself. I don't know about anybody else, but I was like, oh my.
Thank you.
Very much.
Time flies.
That was really nice, guys. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, thank you all. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it. Brilliant. And we also had lots of good comments from
Yeah.